Welcome back to another episode of Leading the Revolution. I thought we'd be finished this book by now. In fact, I just looked at my notes and we were supposed to be on Humanocracy now, another brilliant book by our guest. Welcome back, Gary Hamel.
Nice to be back, Aiden. Yeah, I don't know whether we're just slow or there was a lot of content in this book. I'm not sure.
Man, there is so much content. I was telling you, I'm sharing little excerpts to people all over the world and they're loving it. So relevant, this content, which is really why I wanted to share it. This stuff doesn't go out of date. The names may have changed, but the theories and the processes and the frameworks absolutely more relevant than ever before. This chapter is an absolute cracker. Before we talked about change agents individually inside organizations, but this is more about the organization themselves. And Gary, one of the things I do to prepare for shows is I pick a pin. I've a bunch of pins in a box over there. And I picked out the Phoenix this time because this chapter is about something old, and you call them gray-haired revolutionaries, some organization that's been in existence for a long time and has to burn itself up, walk into those flames, burn itself up, and from the ashes of what it used to be, gather what's still useful. And I'll tee you up here to give context to this chapter. The way you open it is beautiful. You say activists shouldn't not need the courage of Richard the Lionheart or patience of Job or political instincts of Machiavelli to make a difference in their organizations. Sincere but bumbling activists often find themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by those who've sworn allegiance to the status quo. In the age of revolution, we need organizations that celebrate activism. Is this possible? Can the fires of revolutionary fervor be made to burn brightly throughout an organization rather than only in small pockets of insurgency? It sure feels like that. As you'll see in this episode and in this chapter, for those people who have read along or are going to read along, the answer is a resounding yes. Indeed, unless a company can institutionalize activism, it is unlikely to be able to meet the twin challenges of the age of revolution: reinventing itself, a la Phoenix here, and reinventing its industry. 3 companies are covering this. I'm really going to be testing Gary by bringing his memory back because they're huge, in-depth case studies. Charles Schwab, the pioneer of discount stock trading. UPS, we know them, but we did not know what they'd evolved from in the past. And a brilliant company and a brilliant case study in the book, which is the Mexican cement company Cemex, and the amazing reinvention that they did there. So Gary, over to you to give us context to the chapter, and then maybe we'll slice little bits and pieces out of those case studies.
Yeah, happy to. One thing, Aiden, I want to step back for a moment and provide, as you say, a little context. Whenever you write about a company, I've written about a lot of them, you are a bit of a hostage to fortune because organizations go up and down for reasons that are often like exogenous. There's a financial crisis, or you have a change in the business cycle, or even you get a change in the CEO, most typically who comes in maybe with a very different agenda and undoes a lot of what you may have written about. But if you take the long perspective, I think you need to. The real challenge is not so much how do you build a company that forever outgrows its rivals, its industry, and so on, but how do you build a company that is not going to fall into crisis? We did a piece of research. I don't think I ever wrote about this some years back. I got very curious. Presumably, every leader, every CEO, at least of a public company, your goal is to kind of outperform the benchmarks. Now, very few companies do this. But in any case, that's the goal. And so I got curious, like, how many companies do this on any kind of sustained basis? So one of the things we looked at, Aiden, we went back and I looked over several decade spans, and I was asking, what's the likelihood that a company could deliver top quartile earnings growth or revenue growth over a succession of years over that decade? And it's quite interesting, what we found when we looked at this. I think when we looked at the S&P 500 over this particular decade, I think there are only 8 or 9 companies that had delivered top quartile returns in as many as 7 years out of 10, and nobody was any better than that. Now, I haven't run this recently. It might be a little different, but it's extraordinarily hard. Part of this is just arithmetic. If you are rapidly outgrowing your peers or your industry, you pretty soon you're the whole industry. So it's kind of a little bit crazy to expect that any organization is going to outperform everybody else forever. It simply really doesn't happen. And what was interesting is when we looked at the companies that had done that, you found that there's only a relatively small number of ways of doing it. One was you might have been a company that just has a big tailwind behind you, and you're at the right place at the right time where maybe the companies are spending a lot more on IT or AI or something else, and that it's just literally a tailwind that pushes you forward, and you're kind of right place at the right time. The second thing might be you're a startup, you have a killer new business model, maybe Facebook in the early years, and you're just literally watching that company roll that thing out. But inevitably, trees don't go to the sky, curves flatten out, but that's another way of doing it. A third way of doing it is that you do a roll-up, and we saw several of those over the years. In fact, in a way, that's what happened in the cement industry. It got much more consolidated. So for a period of years, the company outperforms everybody else simply by buying your rivals, consolidating them, and so on. That doesn't work with really large mega acquisitions, but if you have a very fragmented industry and somebody figures out how to roll that thing up, what's happening in real estate brokers and a variety of different industries. So that's maybe another way. And then probably the rarest way of all is that a company is just capable of reinventing itself and reimagines it, builds new businesses and so on. Super hard to do. So in a way, even when I look at companies like Cemex, which, is still a major cement company, I don't think their share price has not been like outstanding over the last decade. But in a world where there's so much upheaval, simply the ability to kind of maintain your place in the world and not succumb to crisis and not fall off a cliff is a pretty substantial contribution. So I kind of want to make that clear. Some of the companies I write about, a few blew themselves up like Enron, a few have gone from strength to strength, a few have kind of gone sideways. But that's the fact that some of these companies are still around is actually quite impressive and still doing very well.
You flagged this in the chapter, and I actually saw it because you said even among the thin but vaunted the grey-haired revolutionaries, there are no unqualified exemplars. You said this in the book. There are no excellent companies. No company has totally cracked the code of the new innovation agenda. No company has fully internalized the new innovation regime with its focus on big rule-busting ideas and radical entrepreneurship. But we can learn a lot from those who have made a start. So in a way, you did give yourself a little caveat to go, no company can do this forever. Very few companies endure on the long term. So I did spot that, by the way, man.
And what you find, and we'll discover this as we talk about some of these companies that have reinvented themselves and done so sometimes in very dramatic ways, that has driven growth and so on. But even there, what you find is that often that was the product of a CEO with a set of really deep values. And over time, that CEO leaves. You may get people coming in who are more financial engineers. Those values dissipate and they lose that energy. Or you may have a company where a senior team has set up a particular innovation process. And we can talk about some of these that may be very effective. But again, someone new comes in, or that process runs out of steam, or the urgency behind it disappears. And the reality is there's a lot to learn from these and other companies. But even there, very few companies have really worked to systematize this and to ensure that kind of that innovation engine, that reinvention engine is running year after year in some kind of a disciplined way. So often you create an innovation team or something else that does great work, and then you come back a few years later and it's kind of gone. So I think there's a lot to learn from these companies, but still a lot that needs to be done. Maybe one other kind of definitional thing. Early in the book, I make this distinction about whether an organization can reinvent its industry, which is what startups typically do, and whether an organization can reinvent itself. So I see like a new company like Anduril in the defense industry, which is truly a pioneer, is working on new drone technologies and how do you deliver force with mass rather than just through numbers rather than just size. Super interesting company, very different than a Lockheed or a Boeing or whatever, and how they think about defense. Every industry revolutionary does that. That's the definition of your challenging the way your industry works. But an equal interesting question is, can you reinvent yourself with respect to your past? And I call that renewal. Now, the problem is not in the companies we're going to talk about, but the problem is that sort of renewal, like reinventing ourselves, giving up the past, moving to something new, almost always happens in crisis, right? Or after years of underperformance, you've gone through a few CEOs and somebody finally comes in and says, golly, we have to change where we're going. We have to rethink who we are as a company. So the goal for me is to be able to do both, right? To continually reinvent yourself, but not after the fact, not belatedly, not under duress, but at the same time to reinvent yourself in a way that really changes the industry. And as I've argued before, you don't produce nonlinear returns with kind of conventional strategies. So the number of companies who are kind of in that upper right-hand place who are good at both renewing themselves, creating a revolution in our industry, I call that resilience when you can do both. It's maybe the rarest of all corporate capabilities or institutional capabilities.
I love that. So it's the three R's, there's renewal, reinvention, and resilience all come together. They're the three things to aim for altogether.
Yeah. And if you're not capable of renewal or revolution, what you're left with is retrenchment, right? Which that is where a lot of organizations are. So that's kind of resilience, a renewal, revolution, or retrenchment. And you get to kind of decide where in that space you are.
And I love the case studies in the book. And again, I want to remind our audience, 20 years ago, this book was written. But think as well the research that was done to get to them. And Gary, I have to say that I read a lot of books. And one of the reasons I've gone deeper is because many of the modern books don't go very deep. And it's clear you did extreme research and interviewed so many different people in these organizations, which is why they're such interesting case studies. I really highly recommend it. If you're a company trying to redefine yourself, to totally reinvent yourself, reinvent your industry, the case studies really show that. And UPS, we know what they do today. But when you look back at what they were and then compared to what they are today, it was a totally different business. This was pre-iPhone, pre-Amazon Logistics and all these kind of companies. So I'll set you up, Gary, here with a little quote from that chapter. If you've ever had a cell phone broken while under warranty, you will know that all you had to do was call your wireless carrier, and by the next day a new phone was on its way to you with a prepaid postage label and a box to return the faulty phone. But you didn't probably know that if your carrier is Sprint, for example, the phone sent back to you never actually was touched by a Sprint employee. The new phone came straight from one of the 500 warehouses at the time and stocking locations throughout the country maintained by UPS. And the broken phone went to a cavernous UPS facility in Louisville, Kentucky, where its service parts logistics business operated a repair operation. That's right, your new phone was brought to you by UPS, never by the carrier. I thought that was just a nice way to tee us up to go, somebody inside that company came up with that idea, and the company actually brought it all the way from ideation all the way through to actually existence, which is so rare.
Yeah, I think that business, that little example there, which of course is still a business, I think that got created in the late 90s, about the time I was writing the book. I think they now call it Supply Chain Solutions, and it's about a $13 billion business for UPS. And one of the lessons we're going to see here, and we can get into kind of mechanisms and specifics, but one of the things we're going to see is one of the most, I might have mentioned this before, but one of the most critical things to this capacity for renewal and resilience is to be able to reimagine or redefine your organization in a way that gives you a broader opportunity horizon, right? What you never want to do is to mistake your company and its definition for its business model, because that may be transient and almost by definition is going to have a finite life. And I think what happened UPS had established, I think it was called the Information Technology Strategy Committee, which sounds like one more kind of quango or whatever. But remember, this is 1995. The web is literally just emerging at this point, and Amazon is kind of hardly even exists yet. But it was clear to them, that this emerging technology was going to fundamentally change the way people moved goods around, that it wasn't moving a package. It was all the information that went with that package that allows you to optimize the supply chain and so on. And one of the things that happened at UPS, and it's kind of an interesting question for any company asks, is like, how over the last decade have you challenged and changed your self-identity? Because if that hasn't happened, like, you're on your way to being stuck. And I think the epiphany that happened, it didn't happen all at once. It wasn't like some top-down CEO thing, but as this group of very young people at the time at UPS spread across the company, as they were kind of looking at what's changing, what are the implications for our business, ultimately, the epiphany came when they said, wait a minute, we're not a trucking company with technology. We're a technology company that has trucks. And that sounds like a little bit of wordsmithing, but it says, no, because for almost 100 years, the company had been so focused simply on getting the right trucks to the right place and so on. And what also makes this story a little bit interesting, as you might expect, in a company that prides itself on time service and so on, they were super top down. They were super prescriptive. Like, it was a big move when they decided that they would let drivers decide how often they should wash their own trucks. Because before, you wash your truck every day, whether it's dirty or not. That's kind of dumb in Southern California, where it's probably not going to get dirty very fast. So it was a very buttoned down, very process driven. And so to start to think in these ways, who are we and is there something else we can do? That was a big shift. And I think it would have not happened. A lot of curiosity, a young team, a leadership that said, hey, we're pretty good at what we do, but what else is out there? So that curiosity, that ambition. And so I think, and as we'll see, another theme is they created the time and the space for reflection, right? In most organizations, people are just so busy. So you set aside this group made up of people from across the company, young people and so on. What should we be doing next? And you give them weeks and months to think this thing through. And it wasn't, for that team, it wasn't just an intellectual exercise. They had the power to launch experiments, and they launched many experiments. They made small acquisitions. They set up a venture fund to track kind of companies that they thought, at one point they were into, what's the future of RFID tags? So you take a stake in a little company just so you have the Campbell's noses inside the tent and you can understand, where's this technology going? How might we use it? So I think being alert to how the existing business was kind of plateauing, creating a lot of time and space for people to dig deep into what was changing, bringing new voices into the strategy process, particularly young people. I think that was the key to their capacity to reinvent themselves. Now, I'm sure today FedEx has a big logistics solution business, probably DHL does. So I'm not saying that, but I think they did it earlier, and they did it probably with more kind of focus and so on at that time than anybody else did. The other thing you find there is that in this process of kind of reimagining who you are, one advice I would give to a company is try to redefine your industry or your market so it's many times bigger than your company. I often hear some companies say, like, we're market leaders. Like, what market? The moment you say that, that's like an ambition-crushing thing to say. We're market leaders, right? We're the biggest airline leasing company in the world. Like, whoop-de-doo. All right, so now what? And so you have to constantly challenge yourself to redefine. So going from being a package delivery company, I don't know how big that business is today, but then you say, no, we're a global logistics company. That's a $1.5 trillion space. So I think that's a discipline to every few years step back and say, hey, how do we redefine the space we're in? in a way that we're a relatively small part of that. And that just, as a discipline thing, pushing the opportunity horizon ever outwards.
I love that. I was thinking about that. Like, I'm a big fish in a small pond, and you're actually redefining your pond. Where do I play in a bigger pond? And it's jumping a little bit to the next chapter that I won't do, but in the next chapter, in the next episode, we'll talk about the design rules to get there. And one of them, Gary talks about it, is having the courage to have a stretch goal, because when you have a stretch goal, people imagine differently. Because if it's too incremental, you'll start to innovate incrementally. But I wanted to link it back to the book we covered again, Competing for the Future, the book you co-authored with C.K. Prahalad, where you and C.K. invented the idea of competencies. And what I thought was interesting in the UPS case study was that they took an inventory of their competencies, and then they acquired the ones they didn't have, and then they just reinvented the pond to be able to do more with the ones they did have.
Yeah, I don't think, partly because it was a fairly concentrated industry already, the option of just going out and buying a bigger competitor, taking a big competitor out of play and putting up your margins, I think was never really open to them, and probably a good thing as well. I'm a big fan of acquisitions as a way to build capability. Apple did that when they got serious about building their own in-house semiconductor design capability, and they bought a little company, if I remember, it's called Palo Alto Semiconductor. You get a nucleus of skills and so on. And that's a very different thing than two alternatives. One is acquiring a big competitor to get more pricing power, and or buying a fast-growing startup just so you can kind of plug that thing into your distribution model, like when Coca-Cola maybe buys a fast-growing drinks company. That's not about building new capability. That's just about adding something to the top line and leveraging your distribution structure. It's very different from kind of having a roadmap for building new capabilities and saying, hey, there's some fill-ins we're going to have to need. We need some nucleus of skills, and let's go out and acquire some companies that can help us do that. And I think UPS, at least at that time, was super good in doing that.
And we'll talk about that again as we talk about companies like, for example, Charles Schwab. Brilliant case study here as well. Charles Schwab, I'll let you describe who they are, because many people over this side of the world might not know, but I'll start you off with a little quote. And I love, by the way, the chapter titles here. That didn't escape me. UPS was getting out of the truck, a kind of a nod to the idea of getting outside the building. And then Charles Schwab is bricks and clicks. And I thought it was interesting when you said that, because it was at the verge of the internet really hadn't taken off. And we know that term now, bricks and clicks. But back then, it was quite unique to write that. And at the time, the president and CEO of Charles Schwab was a guy called David Pottruck. And he put it this way. He said, "We are change junkies. We're addicted to change." Very unusual for a CEO to say that. Born a rule breaker, Charles Schwab & Co. led its first revolution when it helped to create the discount brokerage industry by undercutting the steep fees of traditional brokers such as Merrill Lynch and Payne Weber. In the second revolution came OneSource, a mutual fund supermarket that eventually let investors choose more than 1,000 different funds. Before OneSource, it was difficult for investors to move assets between funds, and anyone with more than a few investments received a bewildering array of statements every month. I just wanted to give a bit of context there, because again, we know now how easy it is to invest with apps, etc. But back then, pre-iPhone, pre-smartphone, it was a very different industry.
Yeah. For folks outside of North America, and I think Schwab does maybe have a bit of a business in the UK, I'm not sure, but they are, I think now, the largest brokerage company in the United States. It might be close with another company called Fidelity, but they're definitely probably the largest. They have about $11 trillion under assets. When I wrote this, they had 600 billion, whatever that is, 13, 14 times growth. And again, you find a couple of things here. And one of the things that has always distinguished Schwab is just how unbelievably customer-centric they are. Charles Schwab, the founder, who lives not very far from me, or at least has one home not very far from my home in Silicon Valley. People inside at that time I wrote this said, we almost never heard our CEO, our founder, talk about growth, about profitability, about margins. The guy was always talking about customers. And they had this passion for helping people accumulate, manage, secure their financial lives. And I heard this story, I don't think it was apocryphal, that Chuck Schwab would once a week go serve in a Salvation Army soup kitchen and handing out soup. And one of his thoughts was, maybe if these people had more help earlier on in managing their financial lives, maybe they'd be in a different place. So I think and customer empathy was one of their deep values, because a hugely powerful engine, again, for innovation and a way of escaping the prison of your existing business model is when you really say, who are these customers? How are their needs changing? What else can we do for them? And that's one of the reasons that UPS ended up getting into repairing electronics and the service business, because I think they had invited in Michael Dell and some other computer companies to come talk to them about what's happening in the world of information and data and so on. And they started going, hey, wait a minute, all you guys, all you different companies, you all have this huge repair operation. It's really not your core business. You're not very interested in it. Often you're using the same spare parts to repair things, the same chips, the same whatever. Like, why can't we take this off? But that happened. That insight came from a deep dialogue with customers. And if you are constantly learning from and understanding your customers, the needs, the frustrations, one of the things that we do in a lot of our consulting work is we build a kind of empathy map. And if you can think of, for a moment, Aiden, if you think of a whole menu of human emotions, so you have good emotions. I felt empowered. I felt heard. I felt respected. I was pleasantly surprised. And then you have a negative set of emotions, right? I felt discouraged. I felt ignored. I felt whatever. And then you can think about every stage of the customer action. You start to ask, what are the emotions that we're triggering at every stage of that process? And again, very few companies do that kind of systematic kind of empathy mapping. And it means you have to be out there living with customers. It's something we'll see happen at Cemex, and you have to spend time there. And you have to train your employees to be very attentive to emotional cues from their customers. So when they see somebody that looks perplexed or frustrated, you go, hey, can you tell me what's going on? Did we not, rather than having some stupid phone survey at the end, we're going to text you back, like, how do we do today? No, I want you to listen to me, and then I want my frustrations to go somewhere. So I think that is, again, something common you see to all these companies who have reinvented themselves, is they just go deeper and deeper and broader in terms of understanding their customers. And for Schwab, that was quite a transition, because early on, Charles Schwab was really oriented to very sophisticated investors. So they basically let you trade for yourself. They didn't think you would want any advice. And then over time, they realized, hey, most of our investors are not very sophisticated. And so that, rather than say, hey, that's not our market, we deal with only kind of very sophisticated self kind of managing investors, they said, no, we got to figure out a way to help this. So you build a big network of financial advisors that can help do that. You build 400 branches in the United States, so people can actually, they know where to go if they want to talk about their money. And so that was merging the bricks and clicks in a way that pretty much nobody else was doing at that time. So I think, again, super successful company, one of the few that you can go back and see pivot. And also several of them, Aiden, were ones that would potentially cannibalize their business. So when they went from being pretty much phone-based, and they would execute a trade for you and charge you for that, once you go online, and they had new competitors at the time that people thought were going to take them out of business, or at least challenge them. E-Trade, which is another online trading platform. And there was a big debate inside Schwab, because when when you believe that everybody's going to be online, you kind of have to do it. But at the same time, it was going to cut their trading margins by half. That's a really gutsy thing to do. And so it's recognizing that something is inevitable, right? Everybody's going to trade this way. Nobody's going to want to be sitting out. Everybody's going to, okay. And yet, like, the people we're competing with have much lower prices because there's less overhead. So what do we do? Kind of classic kind of disruptive innovation in that sense. And the only thing you can do is you got to follow your customers. And I think in other companies, we're not so fast, like Merrill Lynch and others, but these guys said, you got to follow our customers. And we don't want to create any opportunity for somebody else to fulfill a need that we have not filled simply because we don't have the guts internally to do it. That was a really tough thing for them to do. Similarly, when they built this like supermarket of mutual funds and so on, they charged a fee for their customers to have access to this large group of mutual funds. And at some point they realized it was more expensive to do business with Charles Schwab than go directly to these other companies and buy the fund. They said, we can't do that. That's not sustainable. So again, they had to change their pricing model. And you have to have the courage in that situation to believe that if you follow the customer, if you give them what they need, if you worry more about that than the short-term margin hit, it will pay off. But there are times when that's a fairly substantial act of faith. But if there's a better technology, if somebody's doing something to change the economics of the industry in a way that benefits the customers, and you're not in front of that, ultimately you lose. And I think they understood that. So they had the guts to move earlier than I think most of their competitors did.
Gary, that thing on fees, so the courage to get rid of fees or be proactive in getting rid of fees or be the one that didn't charge fees in the first place, it made me think, and loads of your book has sent me in many different directions where I write a weekly article. I've loads of them in draft now after reading your books. But I thought about this, and the working title is The Late Fee Effect, and how, for example, John Antioco, the guy who was running Blockbuster, wanted to get rid of the late fees. He got then ousted by Carl Icahn. But also here, you have somebody in Schwab wanting to get rid of them. It made me think about one of the things I'm ashamed about being Irish is Ryanair. If you've ever traveled Ryanair, you'll know what I'm talking about. All the hidden fees and the extra fees that they charge. And sometimes you'll go to somewhere like a Disneyland or somewhere like that, and they'll charge you all these hidden fees. And it creates this resentment in you, and you feel like literally like a captive customer. And I wondered what your thoughts on that were, because that willingness as a leadership team to go, yeah, I know this was a revenue stream, but it's extremely uncomfortable for the customer. We need to have the courage to get rid of it.
It's a really tricky thing. And I don't think, like so many things in strategy, I don't think there's like a rule here that just tells you which way to jump on that. Because let me use an analogy, and then let's come back to Ryanair, which, by the way, I've never flown on.
Lucky you, Gary.
I've never been keen to do it. But having said that, let me give you a counterexample, which kind of makes the point. There are no simple rules in strategy. So I look at the cable television industry here in this country. I don't know exactly how it works elsewhere. For years, the way that industry worked, you paid a monthly subscription. It could be quite high. It could be like $100. And they gave you this huge bundle of programming and channels. And the dilemma with that is you paid for a lot of stuff you never watched. So I believe at one time, the average cable customer in the United States, I'm going to pick a number that's more or less right, but please don't somebody kind of hold me on this. But I think the average cable TV company was paying about $6 a month for a set of sports-related channels called ESPN, which had several different channels. Now, I watch sports, but I never had ever watched anything on ESPN. And yet I'm being charged $6 a month, and I can't do anything about that. And what happened over time, the cable cutters, we started to unbundle that. And now, or bundle it in different ways. Right now I can go to YouTube TV and they have a particular bundle of channels, but it's much cheaper. They have more options and so on. You want to be very careful if you have a model where some subset of your customers is paying for things they aren't using, because that's an opportunity for somebody else to come in and cherry pick them and pull them up. So it's hard to make a rule. If I look at Ryanair, you got to I'd ask a couple of questions like, are customers happy with this? Are they happy that it's a menu? Now, obviously, we'd all like more for less, but they're happy that they only pay for what they use. Or they find the whole thing, does it feel like, to use an American expression, they're being nickeled and dimed? Like at every time you turn around, there's some little hidden fee or something else. So you have to be really sensitive to, does this feel empowering to customers? And thank God I'm not paying for that. Or does it feel that we are taking every opportunity to get back into their pockets? An interesting little story about that. Southwest Airlines, which has had difficulties in the last few years, but it's still one of the top two, I think, most admired airlines in the United States, despite being a discount airline. For years, and it still exists, they have a policy of all of your bags fly free. I guess up to 2. You can't take it into it. Your bags fly free. Wherever every other airline now charges you something for that. And they got a lot of pushback from some of their investors who were saying, hey, you need to charge people for this. And somebody modeled out, like, if you charge $30 or $50 a bag, here's what you get. And so the people of Southwest said, yeah, that's interesting. But instead of doing that, they instead launched an ad campaign reminding passengers that on Southwest, bags fly free. And just that advertising campaign added $1 billion to their market value. Or no, sorry, to market value or revenue. I can't remember. But just reminding people of that fact had a big uplift. And so the CEO said, the investors were right that bag policies makes a difference. They're just wrong on how to go about it. So there's not a simple rule here, but you do have to constantly balance to what extent does this move make life easier for customers or more complicated? Does it empower them or piss them off? And if you're pissing them off, you'll do that only so long until somebody else figures out a better model.
My first job after rugby was in media, so digital transformation for a media company. And we were one of the first radio stations to do audio pre-roll. So when you turned on the app, a little ad would play. And it was a brand new revenue stream. There was no mass distribution of this yet. But the amount of pushback, like I was the guy who brought it in, and I knew it was a terrible user experience. And I was like going, because with any early innovation, you're only making small money at the start. And it was one of those things where the sales guys hated me because they saw it as cannibalization. The marketing people hated me. The programming people hated me because it was like affecting programming, and therefore they thought the audience numbers. But as an innovator, you're like going, it's the future of the company. I got to start somewhere. And today it's everywhere. It's omnipresent, this idea. But it was one of those ones where if you're the innovator, sometimes you're in these situations where you're like going, yeah, I know it's going to be uncomfortable at the start, but that's the future. And I just wondered, had you any observations on that from companies you've worked with?
I do. I think when you see something, a development or an idea inside of your company that is fundamentally pro-consumer, you have to be really careful before you reject that. And one of the problems is so many decisions, there are many decisions inside companies that touch the consumer, but are made by people who know nothing about the consumer. Let me give you one or two examples. So this goes back quite a few years. I was talking to a senior group at a big American car company. And at that time, but Honda and Toyota were growing much faster. And they actually had better than technology. Obviously, Honda's had this reputation for making some of the world's best powertrains. They've been in Formula One. And so at this time, every Honda 4-cylinder car had 16 valves and overhead cams and so on. Just made it run really smoothly, high rev, a beautiful engine. And on the back of every Honda, there'd be a little thing saying 16V, 16 valves, whatever. And so I asked this group of guys at Ford, I said, guys, why don't you even make an engine like this? And they said, to do this would cost us $69. to double the number of valves in the car from 8 to 16. And I said, okay, I get that. But every kid who's buying one of these cars, the enthusiast, they'll pay you $250 more to have that. And obviously this decision was being made by some cost accountants in manufacturing who had no sense of, and you see this over and over again. People understand cost, but don't understand value. I'll give you another example. If you've been inside, I don't know what the Apple store looks like in Dublin, but around the world, there's some obviously very iconic Apple stores. The one in Fifth Avenue, for sure. There's the one in Dubai. But in general, they're really amazing, cool places. And the one in Chicago, which, is just this huge piece of glass right along the river and so on. So I've often asked people in retailing and so on, could you ever get a store like this through your CFO? Because clearly this is not the cheapest way to build retail space. And the answer is no. And I said, yeah, so why would Apple spend this money? Because they want you. And in fact, Rod Johnson, who I've met, he's a nice guy, lives nearby. He was the first CEO of Apple Retail. And I'll get this quote wrong, but he said, we wanted to build something that felt like a public space, like a gift to the community. And so they were trying to create an emotional connection, a bond, whatever, that made customers more likely to buy, made them more loyal, and so on. Is it easy to put dollars and cents on that? I don't think so. But if you look at their margins, I think it's like doing pretty well. So you also have to be super careful about having decision-making processes where people, as I said, people are making decisions that impact customers who are actually not out there, who do not have a real understanding of who these human beings are, what motivates them. And it's interesting. I'm going to see if I can conjure up another example here. But if you think about the words that are important to us as human beings, words like beauty and authenticity and truth and whatever, these are words that are hard to get used in most large companies. Steve Jobs would talk about beauty. And we want to make things that are beautiful, that are lovely to hold, lovely to touch. And so I just think that gets lost. I see it in the call centers where we save a few dollars per transaction by putting something in India or somewhere else, and it's hard to understand, and they don't have your details and whatever. Okay, somebody made a decision to save a few cents without any impact on how that impacts your customers. So I think that's one thing you also see here. The courage to innovate, the courage to challenge yourself comes from, hey, this is undoubtedly the right thing to do for our customers. And so it's up to us to figure out the economics to make that work, rather than say, like, tough. They just have to live with that frustration. Suck it up.
By the way, we don't have an Apple store in Ireland. Yeah, I know.
That needs to happen.
I know.
Jeez.
We have I was just back from, I was doing the talk in Vancouver, and there is a stunning one over there near the art gallery in Vancouver. It's absolutely beautiful. But I actually, I was like, we don't actually have one. They outsource it to a couple of different companies, but they're not beautiful pieces of art. No offense to
Apple, anybody from Apple that's listening, you guys need to solve that. You run a lot of your finances through Ireland. I think they deserve a store.
Yeah. And the factory down in Cork as well.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So I'll come back to, because that idea of get outside the truck and get outside the building is very relevant to Cemex. But there was one last thing, a couple of things I just wanted to pull on Charles Schwab. One was one of the things you identified here, which was early for this as well, which was the innovation meritocracy. And you interviewed a few different people inside the company who were now VPs, but actually were rewarded because they came up with ideas when they were younger, and the company fast-tracked them as a result. And I was thinking about the psychic reward of that, let alone becoming a VP, but other people observing that and going, what the heck? Jenny from HR she's a VP now because she came up with this idea. The idea was implemented, and now she's getting recognized beyond belief. I thought that were literally putting your money where your mouth is, showing behavior and rewarding people who risk things.
No, I think, super important point. Not only in fast tracking those people, does it send a very powerful message? This is how you get ahead in the company, right? You don't get ahead by managing the status quo. You don't get ahead by sucking up. You get ahead by championing a new idea, seeing it through that makes a difference. It also means that as those people grow up, hopefully they understand what that experience was like. They want to mentor those younger career people who may be trying to do the same thing. And you have, and again, I don't know whether this is still true at Schwab, because again, the generations change, but it makes a big difference if the leaders at the top are all innovators, if they've all built something, if they all come up with ideas, if it's not what I call an aristocracy of administrators. And in a lot of companies, that is not the case, right? You have a much more traditional career path. It's mostly about ticking the boxes. And so you end up with people at the top who really have no experience in building something. There was this book, I'm going to forget the author, but it's about Elon Musk building Tesla, and it's called Power Play. And whatever you think of Musk, and he may be somewhat in the process right now of blowing up America's federal government, we'll see how that plays out. But the reason I would encourage every single manager, leader, VP, SVP to read that book is it gives you some sense of what it takes to build something new when there's a lot of headwinds, a lot of things working against you. Because the persistence, the courage, the sacrifice, in some cases, the ruthlessness that you have to have is not something that gets rewarded or selected for in most companies. And yet, if you want to keep moving forward, these are some of the personal traits you have to have. So that's just a little recommendation to anybody listening and watching. Go out and find this book. It's called Power Play. It's by a Wall Street Journal reporter. And we'll see what happens to Tesla, but super interesting story about what it takes to actually build something. And so at Schwab, they had tried to promote people who at least were trying new things. And highly recommended, I would say.
One last thing on Schwab was the rapid experimentation and prototyping, because you mentioned in here as well, like the leaders you interviewed. And again, I just want to remind people, late 90s when Gary did this research and interviewed these people, because we hear today about fail fast, fail often, fail inexpensively, etc. But Gary did this work back then, and Schwab were talking about it because they were saying, we know not all of the ideas will work, but the ones that will pay for all the ones that didn't work. And I've heard people like Jeff Bezos say that today in recent interviews, recent enough in the last decade.
Mm-hmm.
But Schwab were saying this 2 decades ago, which I thought was fascinating.
Yeah. I may have said something like this before, but I think it's important. Innovation is always a numbers game. I look here in Silicon Valley, it's not where I am right now, but where I live most of the time. And a VC company will get 1,000 business plans, and they might have meetings with 100 of those prospective entrepreneurs and might invest then in 10 of those firms, and maybe one becomes huge breakout. But it's those kinds of odds, right? You kind of go 1,000 down to 1. And you can get kind of better over time at picking out the winners so you don't end up with too many losers. As I like to say, you have to be able to distinguish between ideas that are smart, stupid, and not just stupid. But nevertheless, like there's no way around that. And I think Amazon realized that coming out, being a startup and understanding a little bit this process, you understand that I have to recreate somehow that in my own organization, right? I need a process that's generating hundreds of thousands of kind of mini strategies, baby strategies every year. And then we'll try to look at the best and we'll kind of ramp them up and we'll experiment and so on. And so I think Schwab, also a rule breaker, they had that kind of ethos as well, that we just got to be trying more things faster for less money than our competitors. And I don't think there's any way around that. In Northern California, where I live, if you walk out you take a walk, we have a lot of live oaks there, they call them California oaks, and you'll see hundreds of acorns on the ground. And you go, that's pretty wasteful of nature, right? Like, why are you spreading, they're eaten by squirrels or they rot out, whatever. But every once in a while, one of those acorns finds the perfect combination of sunlight and moisture and soil, and it germinates. And we're a little smarter than oak trees, but it's the same arithmetic, right? If the oak tree does not know where the fertile ground is, and often at the top of the company, you do not know where the next idea is going to come from. So if you're not creating that kind of ecology of new ideas and supporting them in some way, like absolutely you miss the future. And in different ways, every one of these companies had a way of doing that. Everyone valued new ideas, knew we had to try a lot of them, were willing to experiment across the organization, not just isolated in one part, but across the organization, within the core business and without. And yeah, it's just, that's an inescapable arithmetic, right? It's like the process of procreation. I don't remember how many million sperm set off in search of the egg, but we all go, oh, we just want one, just find the egg. I don't want all this waste. Well, like life doesn't work that way. So we just kind of have to recognize that. But very few organizations, I think, they may say these words, but very few have the systems, the processes, the freedom, the time, the incentives for that kind of early stage, very expansive idea generation and testing to take place.
Sometimes I have empathy for the leaders of businesses. It's tough work. It's really tough work. It's that saying, I think it was Jim Rohn, do you want to suffer from the pain of discipline or the pain of regret? And in a way, it's that kind of decision. It's like going, I could be the one who eventually leads to the downfall of the business, or I could be the one that reinvents it. Oh, it's way easier just to ride out to my retirement and not do much. Like you see with football coaches or whatever. But Cemex is a brilliant case study. I absolutely loved reading about them. I'll tee you up again, Gary, with a little bit from the opening chapter of this. If there were any questions about whether adversity breeds creativity, Gary says, don't look any further than Monterrey, Mexico, where the headquarters for Cemex was or is, I'm not sure if it's still there, the country's most innovative multinational cement producer. The cement producer isn't the most obvious place to search for examples of revolution and renewal, but then again, neither is Mexico. But Cemex is no ordinary clinker. As the third largest cement company in the world at the time, Cemex enjoyed operating margins that are nearly twice as high as those of its two global rivals. Again, this content probably out of date, but just to show you what it was like then. In 2001, a tough year in general for the world economy, Cemex sales managed to expand a healthy 23% to 6.9 billion. And Cemex is proof positive that new attitudes and new values can change an old industry. What I loved about what you said about them, Gary, was that they literally got beyond thinking that they were a company that sold bags of cement, and they did it in a wide range of things. Learning was at the heart of it.
Yeah, one of the critical lessons to take away from that time frame that I looked at Cemex again, I can't speak for what has happened since, but it's a proof that there's no such thing as a mature industry, and that digital technology, which did play a very important role in Cemex, but digital technology is not the only way you innovate. I've been trying to collect stories, and I'm going to forget them. I've written them down, but I'm super interested in companies that reinvent what look like mature industries. We talked about Lululemon and athletic clothing, where you'd had Nike and Adidas and so on forever. Or I think about a company here in the United States called Athletic Brewing, which does zero alcohol beers. And I think they're probably number 2 or 3 in that segment now, up against the big majors, because they said, this is going to be real. We're going to try hundreds and hundreds of formula and try to find the one that's like the best tasting kind of non-alcoholic beer. And you take this hugely mature industry, or I look at Wayfair or whatever in furniture. So like, never think there's a lot of mature thinking, and particularly in mature industries, because there hasn't been much change there, but there's no such thing as a mature industry. And if you can innovate in cement, like nobody else has an excuse, I think. But again, you see some similar things at Cemex, some different things. Certainly, they have a strong They were very early to understand technology, and in the cement industry, it was kind of very backward in that sense. And one of the things they used technology early on for was not so much like gaining more control, although that was part of it. So you can actually understand what's going on in every cement plant, which historically had their own IT systems, and you talk to them by phone or whatever. And in Mexico at the time, lucky even if you were able to do that. So they were certainly the first in Mexico, maybe the first in the industry to kind of tie all these plans together. And the real benefit of that, Aiden, wasn't like, okay, now I can watch from the center and see who's screwing up. The real benefits, they made that transparent to everybody across the whole company. And so you could very quickly see where you weren't as good. So across multiple criteria, like how much are you paying for energy, for human costs, what is your quality, you could see, or for labor, you could see all of these metrics, and you absolutely very quickly knew where you stood. And I think as a way of provoking improvement, transparency and peer pressure is like, there's probably nothing better than that. So they were very early, and that drove their pace of improvement. They also invested, and I think this is important today as then, they invested very heavily in creating face-to-face meetings and networks. And so at the time, and they probably do this now virtually, but at the time, they were bringing together all of their plant managers from around the world every month in a physical place where you could share like what's working, what's not working, where are you running into trouble. And not only that, but you are building these lateral personal relationships, which means if I have a question about, hey, I know that Ignacio is doing something really amazing in Guadalajara, let me call and see what's going on there and see if like he can send somebody up to help me. The pace of improvement is much faster when I don't have to go up and ask for help, right? When I can connect to other people who are leading whatever it is across the organization, I can learn them very fast, copy them very fast. So that was a big investment as well. Another thing you see there that you saw definitely at both UPS and Schwab was really deep sense of who the customer is. And a lot of their innovation came from that. They were very concerned about how do you help people, poor people, build housing. And so they actually sent a team of mid-level and younger folks out to literally live for a year in one of the poorest parts of Mexico and understand what's the housing challenge for these people. And they learned that one of the ways people accumulate a little bit of money to build a first little four walls or a little extension was you had these community lotteries, mostly run by women, where a family would contribute a little bit of money every month, and then all of that would be paid out to one of the families. And you keep running that little syndicate until every family. So it was kind of like a community savings plan. And they thought, hey, we can help them do that better. We can put the systems in. We can make sure it's done in a fair and equitable way and so on. And you would have never discovered that without kind of like being in that environment, because the senior people at Cemex and whatever, they didn't live that kind of a life. And so they created something called Patrimonio Hoy, which is this little way of helping people save and build houses. And I think thus far, I think it's now about 25 years old, and they've served 600,000 families in that way. They also realized, again, by really following the customer wherever that goes and understanding, not being an order taker, they understood that a lot of the money for families to build houses in Mexico came from Mexicans abroad repatriating their earnings, a lot of them in the United States. And typically there were very high transaction costs on doing that. You'd send money back with the intention that your family would build a building. They might have a party instead. You had no control over that. So they created another business, and his Construmex, I won't remember, but where they would help that person in the U.S. transfer money in at a very low cost, help them specify the materials that were going to be needed. Then those materials will be delivered to your house. And when you're getting cement and not a Corona beer, like there's not much you can do except build the damn extension. You saw example after example of that at Cemex. So let's just follow that customer need wherever it goes. We're here at the end, but let us make it as easy as we can at every stage of that interaction all the way back. UPS, they built a kind of systematic group that was responsible for kind of being a magnet for new ideas across the company and experimenting. I think one thing that Cemex was doing at that time, which I didn't see at UPS or Schwab, is every year they would have a new set of company-wide challenges, like really difficult questions, like how do we make housing easier for poor people, or how do we dramatically shrink the time it takes to build something with our cement, or how do we help contractors get access to the equipment that they need. And so every year there'd be 3 or 4 of these challenges. They would invite ideas from across the company. They would pick the very best of these. They'd go out and experiment with them. And I think we often think about the strategy process is about like making decisions and setting directions and telling the organization where we're going. It seems to me like the top team every year ought to be, and maybe you definitely need to ask around first, but find 3 or 4 really provocative challenges that, if you can solve them, are going to help you grow and expand, and source those to the organization. And Cemex was very good at doing that in a disciplined way, getting ideas back, evaluating the best, getting teams built around them, and going and running experiments. So again, their pace, at least at that time, their pace of experimentation, I think, was probably faster than the other cement company in the world.
Gary, I loved the way Cemex thought. They thought as an organization, and you listened to the CEO at the time in a Stanford speech, and at the time when you wrote this, more than 75% of their sales came from bagged cement powder. So I was thinking about how you're running a company like this. You have a wide range of education, some more open-minded managers on these different sites all over Mexico. Somebody says we're going to spend, they quit millions back then, I suppose, on an IT system. And if I was a franchisee or I was like one of these guys running a site, one of the cement factories, I'd be like, what a waste of money. I can't believe Senor is messing with spending money on stuff that we shouldn't be in. And we have the equivalent of that all the time inside companies. But what I loved what you told us here about Cemex was the bags of cement were typically sold to small construction supply stores where cement makes up about half of their business. Cemex selected 1,000 of these distributors out of 4,000 in the country and started wrapping valuable services around its cement. Their goal at the time was to create the competitive differentiation for something that is a commodity, said one of the executives you interviewed. It may sound strange to treat cement as anything other than a commodity, but then, Gary says, does anybody fault Perrier for treating water as something more than H2O? And there's many more than Perrier today. But what I thought was really interesting was they didn't just go and live with customers. And again, this is another article that I started writing, and I said, get outside of the building. And it was that nod to that quote about get outside and meet your customer. But it was like, get also out of your head that you're in the building game. So as Cemex, get outside there. And one of the people they met was a contractor. And the contractor said, you know what? Winning government contracts to build low-cost housing is actually a great way for me to make money. The problem is trying to get people for long enough, because by the time I get this nod that I can build these houses, and then by the time I construct a team to build it, too much time has passed. And because of that conversation, they created these molds. And the molds then were able to instantly create prefabricated walls or ceilings or whatever it might have been. I thought that was just absolutely brilliant case study of this, and something that you see all the time with companies you work today in the modern day. But maybe you wanted to say something to that kind of mindset in not just Cemex, but in other companies you work with.
Yeah, I think it is this kind of just perpetual opportunity mindset. I don't know how to describe it. Yes, it's being super attentive to the unarticulated customer needs. It's looking at anything that makes it difficult for your customer to do business with you and tackling that, which they did, helping people repatriate funds and get building supplies. But it's just I think it's just a way of being where you wake up every day saying, hey, I live in a world where like amazing number of interesting problems to solve. What can I do? And it's kind of the opposite of kind of this static view of this is my business and this is what I'm going to do. One of the analogies I use, it's maybe not a very good one, but I'll use it anyway. I think a lot of people in business, they think of their business like a little farm. And I have my 40 hectares or acres or whatever it is, and I plant every day and I harvest and I hope for rain and so on. But it's a very static thing. That's not like over time, maybe the soil becomes depleted or people don't want that crop anymore, or the EU says you can't grow it, or I don't know, whatever. But that's my plot of ground. I think maybe you should be more like a shark, where you can never stop swimming. You're always moving to find what you can consume, what you can eat, and so on. But it's not static. And I don't know where that comes from. Is that a personal trait? Is it something? Certainly, I think you can encourage it in an organization. But the other thing I would say about Cemex, and I suppose this is maybe today, not a very interesting thing to say, but nonetheless, I think what Cemex understood 25 years ago, I think what Hire understood 25 years ago or believed, is that you can build a world-class company anywhere in the world, right? And geography is not destiny. Industry is not destiny. You can build an innovative, fast-growing, amazing company in any part of the world today. Partly because technology is very mobile, knowledge is very mobile. When Hyundai, and I think the fastest growing automaker to 100 million vehicles in history, they were flying in engineers from Toyota every weekend to help them. So I'm told. I don't have any firsthand knowledge, but I was told that. So, yeah, do not let your geography or industry, whatever, put a ceiling on your aspirations. And I can tell you, being a relatively small company by global standards in Monterrey, Mexico, and saying, oh, we're going to be like the best managed, most innovative cement company in the world. They had no right, you would say, to think that way, but they did. And so we'll maybe talk about it when we talk next time, but it's kind of tautological, but no organization outperforms its aspirations.
Beautiful way to finish. I was going to add to it, but I'm not going to, because I love the hope in that message, Gary, and I've taken enough of your time. I had loads more in that chapter, but I'm going to leave it to you, the audience, to read that for yourself, because there's a list of routes to renewal that Gary gives as well, routes to be able to get there. The one thing I did like about the Cemex story was the CEO says, you know what, one of the things is when you're from a poor country like we are, you got to work harder. And that's what I find, that hustle, that desire to hustle, because you're not complacent. Gary, for people who want to find you, find out more about your work, keynotes, etc., where's the best place to find you?
GaryHamel.com, and anybody can drop me an email. I'm just Gary at GaryHamel.com. So yeah, happy, and find me on X at Prof. Hamel, on LinkedIn. Always happy to have a conversation here with some people's minds.
Brilliant, Gary. And again, we'll try and wrap it up. Try to wrap up Leading the Revolution. I'm loving it. I'm hoping not boring you, Gary, by revisiting your old work, because I have loads more to get through behind there for people that can see us on the video here. Author of Leading the Revolution, Gary Hamel, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Aiden.